This is Malvern in the English Cotswolds, and looking at the cars, it's hard to believe it's the 1980s. And the reason for this invasion by some 600 mouth-watering motoring machines? Well, it's the Golden Jubilee of the Vintage Sports Car Club. And this week sees the culmination of a whole year of events featuring some splendid motor cars and their equally fascinating owners. Bentley, Lagonda, Sunbeam, Bugatti, ERA. That these and a rich variety of other superb classic cars survive today, not only in running order, but actually competing in anger, is due to the far-sightedness of a group of young British enthusiasts exactly half a century ago. Showing commendable good taste, the first task of those young founders, after they'd named the Vintage Sports Car Club, was to wet the new baby's head with a few pints. Another good idea. Tell me, Peter, how did it all actually come about?
Well, it started off with a letter to a magazine called The Light Car by a chap called Colin Lindsay Nicholson, who apparently wasn't doing very well in trials with his old Austin 7. Yeah. And he was getting beaten by the more modern cars. So he suggested a club for old Austin 7s and sort of fairly cheap cars where they could hold their own trials and, you know, one of them might win. And so he suggested this club, and they had a meeting, but it didn't go on to be for sort of old Austin 7s because people suggested what they ought to have in it were things like vintage Bentleys, Vauxhalls and Alvises who were building sports cars in the 20s. Yeah. And so they decided to make the club for this sort of car. And they were going to call it the Veteran Sports Car Club. But there was an objection from the Veteran Car Club, which started in 1930 for pre-1905 cars.
I think vintage is a better word.
Well, it is. So
Veteran means old and doddery.
That's right. Vintage means rather cheerful.
Yes. And still in its prime.
That's right, yes. Yeah. So they started this club, and originally Nicholson said we'd move the date forward every 2 years, so that the cars were always 2 or 3 years old, but they decided to chop it off at the end of 1930. Yeah. And in fact, the reason they said was because that no vehicle worthy of being calling a motor car had been built after midnight on December the 31st, 1930.
Especially if you chop it off every 2 years.
Well, that's right. And of course, there were big changes in motor cars round about 1930 because all the, you know, nickel-plated radiators and they were getting pressed steel bodywork and chromium plating and that sort of thing. And there was a big change in the cars.
But then what happened?
Well, then they started to organise events for these cars, in particular trials, that's sort of going up muddy hills, and speed trials, and eventually race meetings. And they were centred, the first secretary, called Tim Carson, who was secretary from, I think, 1936 to 1971, he had a pub called the Phoenix at Hartley Wintney in Hampshire, and that was the sort of club headquarters where they used to meet.
They still meet at pubs today, often the starting points chosen for a variety of keenly contested events run for the 5,000 to 6,000 people who now belong to the club all over Britain. In March, a Somerset village saw some of them gathering for the Wessex trial, a sort of rally for masochists, though everyone did seem to be looking forward to it. For virtually 2 full days, the competitors have to follow a route that links a series of rough hill climbs. Points are scored according to how far up the driver and his passengers can manage to persuade their car to go.
Right. Now we've got to do is get it blown away, we'll lose it. No, not the hills, it's all obvious.
On this occasion, the weather was cold but dry, and the teams were expecting a pleasant weekend sport. First, though, a chance to catch up on the gossip.
The last Riley Register meeting I went to, coming back on the way home, we ran out of petrol, knocked some people up in the middle of the night, got some fuel, he came out with the fuel, and we drove about another 2 miles, stopped at the crossroads, and the crank broke. So he didn't tow us back. He didn't tow us home, he pushed us home, actually. A friend of ours sat on the bonnet of his car, and he shoved us along.
Next, scrutineering, the process that checks that the cars are legal and safe to take part, and that the wheels don't come off. That's David Marsh, sorting out a magneto problem on his 1925 Vauxhall. The trouble's so pressing that he's even forgotten his beer. Taking part are marks from a golden age of motoring. Cars worth preserving, like this 1903 Mercedes 60 belonging to Roger Collins. Magnificent. Off they go. It's a scene that's changed very little since the 30s. But there's no lack of colour in the cars, nor the people who own them. Members of the club clearly get plenty of sport from their mounts. And that's really what the VSCC is all about. The ideals of the founders specified competition as much as preservation. No sacred cows here. These are sports cars as much as precious cars. And they're meant to be used and enjoyed in their element on events like this, the hills and gullies of the Wessex Trial. The curator of a motor museum would probably turn white if he saw this, but it's all in a day's sport to the trialists. Hamish Moffat has been trialling for over 30 years, and the experience shows. When most drivers would call it a day, Hamish pushes his Bugatti until there's not an ounce more impetus left. That's the difference between the expert and the also-ran. Then it's on to the next hill to do it all over again. Hamish Moffat makes it look easy, and to talk to top trial exponents to think there was no skill involved. Take Austin 7 specialist Barry Clark.
There are two ways of winning a trial. One is by being a very good driver, and the other is by putting the car together right in the first place. I've always preferred the latter approach because I'm not a very good driver. And if you put the car together right, you should be, anyone should be able to drive this car to the top of the hill. You just start on the start line, put your foot on the throttle, and it goes. There's nothing to it. Well, I do put a little bit of lead in my right foot before the start of the trial. It is, in fact, true that one of the things you mustn't do is chicken out when it gets rough. I mean, you can go too fast with things, but far too often people think, oh, this is too rough, lift off and fail all.
The sheer torque of the Vauxhall makes short work of the unusually dry hills. That pre-start tweaking obviously paid off. Different hills, different drivers, different techniques, not always so successful. bouncers can be worth their weight in points, but not always. Fraser Nash enthusiast Freddie Giles seems to sail up without any apparent effort. So what's the secret of the Nash's success?
Yes, well, it's chain drive, like all good cars should be, you see. Solid back axle, so both wheels are driving. And I have got a modification which is a very large sprocket on the back, which suits me very much in dry weather. In wet weather it's useless. So today, yeah, it's going quite nicely. 3, 2, 1, go!
Driving up the hills, what runs through your mind? With Freddie, it's coaxing her along.
Because she's the girl that's doing it, really. I mean, it is a team effort, but you urge the car on and tell her, you know, come on, gal, come on.
And does she respond?
Oh, yes, like all good women respond.
Interesting that Freddie's Nash is female, while Jane Arnold Forster's car is definitely a male, as she's discovered while doing her own maintenance.
Oh, yes. It helps you get to know him better. I mean, he's an old friend, as it were. Not only that, but you know which noises are serious and which noises aren't.
And that's important. 2 days of this takes its toll and calls for some running repairs. At the finish, the results showed that Barry Clark had won his class. Overall winner, David Marsh and the Vauxhall. But if the Wessex is an uphill battle, it's not the only one in the VSCC calendar. It's May, and many of the club members have journeyed to Devon. Preparing to blow away the winter cobwebs, a paddock full of drivers, supporters, and a whole spectrum of sporting vintage cars, some more willing than others.
Lena!
Rebecca Guns Austin 7 heads out of the paddock to join a full entry list for the start of a day's hill climbing VSCC style. For some, hill climbing means pouring on the power, shaving off the hundredths of a second.
Beautiful.
For others, runs could be measured with an hourglass. It's a case of head down and keep pedaling. Pity there's no time to admire the scenery, for Wiscombe Park is one of those places that could have been painted as a perfect backdrop for the colour and sound of the hard-charging heavy metal and the chugging Edwardians and the buzz of the little 500s.
On the line, Rebecca Gunn, driving wedge niches, very nicely turned out, Ulster Austin 7.
Rebecca Gunn's forced to tackle it backwards, balked by an earlier competitor. Whiz corner, bunny's leap, saw bench hairpin, off for another 1,000-yard sprint. In the paddock, there's time to relax over an alfresco lunch. Pull out the car seats and enjoy a grandstand view. Whatever he's driving, each competitor pits himself against the hill, locked in his own solitary battle with the stopwatch, polishing technique. If the rain comes down, there's just another challenge. Something to beat, something to talk about when next they meet.
There will be a driver's briefing for how the event was after the cars have been assembled on the grid.
The 194-strong entry for the Jubilee year's first Silverstone meeting was the biggest the club's ever had, proof that it's thriving in its 50th year. This is the glamour end of the vintage world. Here you'll find the most famous old cars in Britain. But the vintage community embraces as many interesting people as it does cars. From diligent types who built their cars from bits in drafty garages to the full-blown and unashamedly indulgent. People like Pink Floyd drummer Nick Mason. How did he get hooked?
I got involved through my father. I've been coming to vintage motor racing since I was about 7 years old. And that led inevitably into driving. They're cars that I've lusted after since I was a child. They all represent a peak of some sort in motorsport. The Bugatti is, to my mind, the finest vintage racing car. The RA, terrific pre-war, and the Maserati post-war.
What do they like to drive?
Wonderful. Really exciting, thrilling. It's a triple thrill, really. It's to do with the actual attractiveness of the car, the way it actually looks, and the lines, and the way when you're actually sitting in it, it's a very special sort of view. And the history. If you drive a 250F, you tend to think of Fangio or Moss driving. Plus the third thing is actual motor racing, which is fun at any level, I think.
For the money Nick spent, he could buy a Grand Prix car.
I think I've got some Grand Prix cars.
This was the biggest car at the meeting, the 24-litre monster Napier Bentley.
Well, it's won most of the vintage events on quite a regular basis at one time, but unfortunately this sort of car, which is classed as a special, they're now banned from races like the race of today, the Atala Trophy, so we enter them in other races now, unfortunately, but there we are. At least we're lucky to be able to run them. I love large engines, and they're different. Rather like a Spitfire on takeoff.
ERAs are among the most prized racing cars in the world, though only 14 of the classically shaped ones were built. Best known of all ERAs is Remus. It's raced by the Honourable Patrick Lindsay.
Certainly Remus is one of the most famous of the single-seater racing cars and of the first, well, of the pre-war ones. And Remus has been racing for many, many years in Vintage Sports Car Club meetings with Bill Moss for many years and myself for 20-something years. It was the car which was driven by Prince Birabongsi of Siam. He was called Bira. And blue and yellow are the Siamese racing colours. And Bira was very successful. He was more successful in Romulus. But this car had a great history after that. The cars are very beautiful. They're beautifully made. And when a car is 1936 like this car, and yet is going extremely well, that's quite exciting. And of course they all look different. They, you know, the modern racers to a certain extent all look exactly the same. And then you can see the driver driving, which is an added bonus, I think. You've got a lot of power, more power than you can put onto the ground. So the car's quite lively, quite skittish, and so it's very exciting, yes. Wouldn't be much fun if it wasn't.
There have always been those who bemoan the risky use of these rare and valuable racers. Connaught enthusiast Alan Cottam is not among them.
I mean, they only rot if they're not raced. And I think I'd rather see one, if it's got to die, at least die in its right environment rather than rot into the floorboards. A colleague of mine who'd owned this from the works, he used to occasionally drive it, and he frightened himself a little bit, and he came to me and he said, Alan, would you like to buy my Connaught, otherwise I'm putting it in store forever. So much against the grain of many people in the Vintage Club, I sold the ERA and bought this. It is the nicest little single-seater that I've ever driven. I rebuilt it when I bought it, and we've kept it the same ever since, you know. We have a look at it, you know, usually once every 2 years.
Another ERA man is Bill Morris.
And a lot of people feel that although we race old motor cars, it's not very competitive, but they'll just suggest they come here and have a see, because in fact the competition is really very fierce up the front. We don't knock each other off because we value the cars too much, but it is stiff and it's hard work, and everybody's trying their best and looking after their very expensive pieces of machinery.
They're right, there's plenty of close racing in the VSCC. And so they all came to Malvern, and so did I. I'm fascinated by it, and I hope eventually to be able to give them a chance to drive on, but I expect your gearboxes are so precious. You don't want somebody like me horsing around with it.
Well, possibly not.
Always remembering that I myself did once own an Austin 7.
Well, that's quite
my
thing,
first motor car during the war was a little Austin 7.
And you remember the clutch on it?
The clutch is only that much.
That's right, yes, I know.
It might be difficult to change.
They're all like that.
Altogether, perhaps 700 cars congregated at the Three Counties Showground. The vintage sportsmen, their families and friends, took over the hotels. And having filled the guest houses, they overflowed to campsites all around the ground, peddling their cars and living close to them. They came from all over Britain, but from much further afield too. I met a bunch from Australia.
So
and you've brought how many cars from there to here?
There's 5 cars coming the contingent coming to Jubilee.
I'm interested in the practical side of it. How did you bring them? You didn't fly them?
No, we put them in containers. We double-decked them in containers, so they're in a sort of semi-mounted position.
By sea?
Mm.
By sea. What do you mean semi-mounted?
Well, one above the other, as it were.
And 5 motor cars, how many people?
It's between 35 and 40 people altogether from Australia who've come over for the Jubilee especially.
And it's quite a big movement over there.
Oh, you're just as keen as here.
With the visitors came a host of fascinating stories.
There we are. Probably interesting to see the car in this condition. It's a very well preserved example, possibly the only one there is of this particular model. Went out to Argentina in 1910 as a new car and spent the first 55 years of her life out there. Finished up as a taxi in Buenos Aires. Just been registered for the first time in Britain after 74 years.
Yes, we found this car in the Australian bush. The chassis had been under a foul yard for 27 years and the engine driving a big saw blade up in the backwoods. We got all the parts together and got the drawings from France and rebuilt the car ready to run in the Peking to Paris race. But as yet that event hasn't been, and so I decided to fly the car over here and run it for this event, which is what we did. It's a great car. There's only about 3 of them left in the world. It's 1922 Peugeot 3-litre.
It looks difficult enough. I mean, it would be difficult enough for me in my car. What are the special difficulties when you're in a vintage car?
Well, I don't think, you know, it's really all that much more difficult than it would be in a modern car, except that you can't sort of whip the gear lever through like you can with a synchromesh box.
No.
But because it's all done against the watch, you see, and it's the quickest chap who wins.
Ah.
And of course, if you knock a bollard over, you lose a lot of marks.
You lose points, and I believe if you turn upside down.
Yes, we had to make a rule about that because people were trying so hard, they were turning upside down. So we now disqualify them doing that.
If they're still alive.
We'll try and discourage them.
Yes, I see what you mean. An AC sociable. No reverse gear, so it needs a little help. I'll take a closer look at that one later. You've got to hand it to them. Crash gearboxes, long chassis with little steering lock, skinny tires, 50-year-old brakes, and they still tackle a course with more cones on it than an M1 diversion. There's that AC. Well. I think I saw as you came up, it's only got 3 wheels.
Oh yes, quite safe though, very stable.
The one at the back does the driving.
Yes, that's right.
And also the gear changing and
that's right, yes,
everything.
There's a 2-speed gear in the back wheel.
And I mean, if you don't mind me asking your name.
Lucy Hall.
Lucy Hall, how do you do, Lucy? And are there many of you ladies involved in this?
A fair number actually, more than most people expect.
Yeah, and are there many of these?
Not very many.
It looked like a black crab approaching with those
Thank
2
you very
big
much.
eyes. Well, you know, sort of looks faintly evil.
It does a little, yes.
But it's not evil.
Oh no, there are very few left.
And it's this fascinating control.
Oh yes, tiller steering. And this is my top gear. First gear is a pedal on the floor.
And the throttle's rather like aeroplane
That's
throttle.
right, yes. Throttle and ignition, just 2
and
levers.
I'm glad to see you've got audible warning of approach.
Just about.
And where Where is this from? What part of England?
Well, I keep it down in Dorset. I live up in Gloucestershire, but haven't got anywhere to keep it. My grandfather, who lives down in Dorset, keeps it for me. He found it, 15 or 20 years ago in a furniture store in Bridport.
Not much good in bad weather, I should think.
It has got a hood, but if you put that up, you can't really see, so, so it's better without.
And basically, what do you use it for?
Well, the driving tests and the light car rally, and that type of thing.
The light car rally. Starting in the Cotswolds, competitors on one of those light car rallies prepare for a navigational exercise away from the traffic of the main roads.
Follow yourself to edge of map. Well, that's okay. Right, so on to the next map.
There you go.
Or...
Hold the... put this up.
Yeah. Edge of map.
The vintage motorist has never relegated his woman to a backseat role, except in a good cause. I've never driven anything like this, Peter, and I mean, my car at home's got an automatic gear.
Yes.
But how do you cope with all that?
Well, this has got a crash gearbox. It's got no
like a
mess. And if you make a mess of it, you really make a mess of it.
You really crash it. That's
Actually,
why they call it that.
on the other hand, if you do it properly, I mean, if you change down and get it absolutely synchronized, it goes like a knife through butter.
But
it doesn't
also,
often happen.
I noticed that you've got it in the right hand.
It's a right-hand gear lever. Yes, it's quite normal in vintage cars, really.
And the handbrake is on the right,
handbrake's
too.
on the right, that's right.
Everything is on the right.
It is, actually, yes. Well, I think I expect people to be right-handed instead of left-handed.
And I noticed, too, that the whole car seems to, what would you say?
It weaves. The whole chassis does. In fact, I had a vintage Alfa Romeo 2290, and the body actually cracked down here due to the chassis flexing. It originally had a fabric body, and we put an aluminium body on. It actually cracked the bodywork because it flexed.
When we turn, it hasn't got a tremendous lock.
No, it's 1250. It's a 1250 Alvis. It has rather a poor lock.
So you're changing down now.
Right.
Do you change down because it slows up better? I mean, are the brakes any good?
The brakes are very good on this car. They're not on all vintage cars.
Is it just a direct cable from your foot more or less straight to the brake drum?
That's right, absolutely. Yes.
Really?
No hydraulics.
No.
Yes, no hydraulics.
Well, so far we haven't hit anything.
No, that's absolutely right.
What could be nicer than a day out in the sunshine, enjoying the sights and smells you only get from an open car in the country? And if you don't shine at navigation, you can certainly shine at the Concours d'Etat. This is a sort of beauty contest for the finest vintage cars. But unlike the other kind of beauty contest, originality as well as condition is being judged. one of these cars is the result of countless hours of effort by its owner and almost as many hours of judging. Many of the cars were recovered as worthless relics. Some have been handed down as heirlooms. Yet others have been assembled over a period of years from painstakingly reconditioned parts. Whatever their background, they're the apple of their owner's eye. Winning here has little to do with prizes, trophies or awards. It's simply the satisfaction that your car has been recognized by those who know for its sheer perfection. For myself, I thought they were all exceptional. But I caught up with the Swiss owner of a superb Alfa Romeo to find out how he'd come by his example.
Very pretty blue car is a Delage.
This magnificent engine powers an Alfa Romeo, originally built in Paris, and is owned by this chap standing here who is from Switzerland.
Switzerland, yes, from Zurich.
What was this like 6 years ago?
Well, it was a heap of scrap, actually.
Yeah.
There was nothing of the body except the tank, which comes from an original Monza.
This was originally a Monza?
No, this was a long chassis which was chopped and very badly treated.
What gave you the idea of putting it all together? Why did you put it all together?
I always wanted a Monza, but I couldn't afford a genuine one, so I found this chassis, which was rather complete, and thought this is a good idea to make a Monza from it, because there was nothing, no body was there, and I had a tank.
They're all proud owners. If the vintage spirit goes to their head, well, it's only once every half century.
This is the spirit.
Malvern attracted them all, the rallyists and driving test experts, the hill climbers and mud pluggers, those fastidious Concours buffs. It was a big date in the diary. But it was only a milestone on a journey that began before many of today's drivers were born, a time when the breathalyzer and seat belts weren't needed and when the roads were free. So Malvern was a celebration to mark the first 50 years of a promise that evolved when a group of young men refused to get into step with the march of mass production and clung to the character of motoring that they held dear. Could they have dreamt that it would come to this? Hundreds of cars and thousands of members supporting their club half a century later?
No, I'm pretty sure they didn't. I mean, they were mostly young men, mostly impecunious, and they just did it for the moment, you know.
Yeah.
They wanted to play with their old motor cars, but the great thing is that it's built up and it's ensured that we keep these old cars going.
And what of the future? Judging by the number of youngsters being raised in the traditions of the VSCC, the cars and the competitions will pass to another generation. Into their charge will go the Austin 7s and the Olvises, the Bentleys and the Bugattis. Lucky youngsters, inheriting the next 50 years and the vintage spirit.
We're only here for a laugh, aren't we?
Not the glory, nor the money, nor the worries, nor the hassle, nor the thing. No, it's just, we do it for fun.